not 1%, but 0.0004% of the population earn more from inheritance than they do entrepreneurialism. So, I mean, that flies in the face of the idea of, the self-made man or woman and the American dream.
We're in the middle now of what's known as the Great Wealth Transfer. It's this massive movement of funds from the older populations to the younger ones.
The Bank of Mum and Dad is the sixth largest mortgage lender in the UK. This is not just a 1% thing. This is not just a 10% thing. We're talking about around 80% of people expect some kind of inheritance. And so we have an economy now where you're more likely to get on the housing ladder by being loyal to your parents than being loyal to your boss.
Is that why you sometimes say we need to talk about this Bank of Mom and Dad and encourage a dialogue amongst maybe generations and classes?
What happened was,
imagine a world where all of your wealth is given to you by your parents, where you earn very little during your lifetime, but rely on an inheritance. This is something people are calling the Bank of Mom and Dad. I'm Bradley Sherman, and this is Population Next. Today on our show, we're speaking with Dr. Eliza Filby. She's a British writer and generational historian who's uncovering this trend of the bank and mom and dad across England, the greater United Kingdom, and of course, the world. You see, we're in the middle now of what's known as the Great Wealth Transfer. It's this massive movement of funds from the older populations to the younger ones, and it's happening incredibly unevenly. She's gone so far as to call this an inheritocracy. Eliza, welcome to Population Next.
great to be here, Bradley.
You're our second interview, in fact, across the Atlantic, so I'm excited to bring your perspective to our listeners and viewers today. Eliza, you talk a lot about the Bank of Mom and Dad being one of the biggest banks in England. It's certainly one of the biggest banks here in the United States. I'm wondering if you could shed some light on how we got here and how this Bank of Mom and Dad might be changing the nature of the intergenerational contract, but also the social contract.
Wow, that's a great question to start, and it's a big question to start, and it is ultimately the question, really, is how have we got here? So it's a global phenomenon, but it's actually particularly concentrated in the UK and the US and in the English-speaking world and Northern Europe. This transfer, this great wealth transfer that the financial services industry talk about and almost salivate at, this idea of all this money trickling down from the boomers into Gen X, millennials, and eventually also Gen Z and Gen Alpha. And in the US, it's estimated to exceed $68 trillion. $68 trillion. And, it's the largest wealth transfer in history. So let's just kind of sort of understand the magnitude of this. This is the largest wealth transfer in history, and really the biggest transfer of wealth coming and not just to the top tier wealthiest families. This is a largely democratic process, okay? Some have the Bank of Mum and Dad, many don't have the Bank of Mum and Dad, but this is not just a 1% thing. This is not just a 10% thing. We're talking about around 80% of people expect some kind of inheritance, okay? Now, obviously, the amounts of that inheritance vary considerably. So how did this happen? Well, let's just consider, I think, reframing how we think about the baby boomers. We think about the baby boomer generation as kind of setting the standard as what to do in terms of the acquisition of assets, investments, pensions, financial security. And in many senses, they have set the standard, but in many senses, they are the exception. They had access to sort of three things that their millennial counterparts, that their millennial children, haven't really had access to the same degree. Number one was really good pensions. Number two was much more affordable housing. And number three was rising wages. Now, it impacted different people in different sectors, and certainly different classes and different kind of socioeconomic groups differently. But we saw that massive population surge, that baby boomer cohort after the Second World War. They were exceptional because there's so many of them. They're exceptional Now, because there is so much money in that cohort, and to a large degree, being part of that cohort, that baby boomer cohort, has served them extremely well, because politics has swayed to their have kind of skipped to their beat. Economics has skipped to their beat. The corporate world and consumerism has skipped to their beat throughout their life. And actually, the financial services industry has as well. So they were the first generation to acquire so many assets, acquire so many savings, and actually didn't really spend them in the same degree, certainly, that millennials have in certain different ways. So there's this extraordinary amount of money that has been acquired in this generation. I don't think it's going to be replicated in the next generations coming. But I think the key thing is now it's very apparent how much of it is already trickling down. Right. So we have to recognize that one of the chief ways that baby boomers have been spending this money and investing this money is in their children. We already use the language of investment when it comes to our parenting. We're investing in our children's future. And in America, of course, a lot of that is so much about investing in education and college tuition and, saving from your kids' earliest age for college. So a lot of it has gone on education. Increasingly, the bank of mum and dad has been trickling that money down into housing, getting those millennials and now Gen Z on that housing ladder. So you're gifting while living. So it's a huge phenomenon in the UK. The Bank of Mum and Dad is the 6th largest mortgage lender in the UK. It's exactly the same in the US. Different property culture, certainly different renting culture. But the Bank of Mum and Dad in the US is a top 10 mortgage lender for first-time buyers in the UK, in the US. So that money is trickling down now into property, and eventually, it will eventually transfer on the point of death. So it's not just that this sort of flood of money that's going to happen and sort of realize itself over a couple of years. Really, this is it started, really, I would argue, at the turn of the 21st century. And it will be gradually and more realized as we move into, 2020s, 2030s, 2040s, as that baby boomer cohort dies out.
Right. And we have a little bit of a nuanced maybe approach to it because of our tax code here.
Yes.
And that is currently up at the end of this year for how much boomers can leave to really anyone can leave to their progeny. It's being refigured into the tax bill currently to extend those tax cuts and that death tax further. But the ultra high net worth and the high net worth people are moving millions already.
Yes.
It's really quite astonishing. And I think I heard the statistic, and I hope you can correct me if I'm wrong, that 2% of this great wealth transfer, 2% of the population in charge of this are really in control of about half of the wealth that's moving. Is that the case in the UK?
The first thing to say is that actually it's really hard to compute how much money there is and how it's moving. That's the first thing. The second thing is it is true that the top, not 1%, but 0.0004% of the population earn more from inheritance than they do entrepreneurialism. So, that flies in the face of the idea of, the self-made man or woman and the American dream. And that it is true that more and more of the ultra high net worth cohort are making increasing percentage of their wealth from inheritance rather than from any sort of hard work or entrepreneurialism. So I think it's, we have seen in the last 15 to 20 years a massive explosion in family offices, financial advisory services and products and initiatives and networks serving the ultra high net worth families, not just heirs, families, because actually the transfer of wealth within a family isn't the more money involved, the harder it gets, right? We've all seen Succession, right?
Yeah,
and particularly tricky. If there's a family business kind of implicated in all of this as well, even more so. If there's a first generation patriarch or matriarch who was self-made and made the money and then has to hand it down to their kids who weren't self-made and had a very different childhood to the patriarch, there is a tension there in values, attitude towards money and lived experience that makes that transfer incredibly difficult. So as much as we like to say, that the ultra high net worths are really sort of really lucky in this whole great wealth transfer story, actually, from my experience dealing with a lot of ultra high net worth families, that it's even more complicated. If you add into that a sense of obvious complexity around family formation, when we're talking about divorce, the divorce rate for the 50 plus has doubled since 1990 in the US. So divorce, remarriage, blended families has significant implications for estate planning.
Sure.
And that's particularly true, again, the more money involved.
Yeah, we say more money, more problems.
Yeah. Yeah. But then it's, you can't, but then you can't ignore the fact at the heart of this story is a decline in meritocracy, a clear social divide between those that have the bank of mum and dad and those that do not. But just to emphasize my sort of original point, is this is not a 1% problem. This is actually a real sort of challenge for what I call the mass affluent. Those that have got a decent pension, acquired decent mortgage-free assets, and are seeking to pass that down to their children.
I'm curious, just a bit of an aside. Do you think that this inheritance culture could be getting in the way of innovation? I mean, we've always had the ultra wealthy, and we would, historically, of course, in the 1300s, 1500s, 1600s, we would classify them just as the aristocracy, the people that just sat at the top and ruled. This is a little bit different, though, because it's so central to wealth. And I'm wondering if that money that's moving, do you think we're going to see it reinvested? Do you think people who are recipients are going to reinvest it in their own businesses or their own ideas? Or do you think they're just going to sit on it?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a great question. In many respects, it is the question because, I come from the UK where we, part of the history of this island is the sort of the aristocracy opposing the Industrial Revolution, the opposing the innovation of that great transition to the industrial age. And that took sort of 40 years to work itself out, as it were, and eventually the industrialist won, and the aristocracy declined. They weren't eradicated, but they declined. And I think there is a case to look at the 21st century and say, despite all the sort of sense of change and innovation and disruption that we talk about, that maybe at the heart of our economy is a passing down of wealth rather than a making of wealth, and that actually being sort of against the tide that encourages innovation and encourages risk and encourages true disruption. They say, the old adage is that, wealth is eradicated within 3 generations,
Right.
The first,
or sooner, depending on the
the first makes it, the second sustains it, the third squanders it. And there's absolute definite historical truth and proof from that, which I find fascinating. So maybe this is a temporary thing, but I do think that you're absolutely right to highlight the sense of obligation when you inherit money. And that money could be $5,000, it could be $500,000, it could be $5 million. The sense of obligation and sense of responsibility of inheriting wealth can actually feel emasculating, infantilizing, and disabling. So I think it's a brilliant question, absolutely brilliant question.
So here's I think the rub of it. Do you think that because of the confluence of these economic realities that are just hitting younger generations, millennials, Gen Z, and likely Gen Alpha head on, rising housing costs, rising education costs, rising healthcare costs, particularly here in the United States, which is putting them on that ladder to growing wealth later, if at all.
Yep.
Does that only kind of make this worse? And is that why you sometimes say we need to talk about this bank of mom and dad and encourage a dialogue amongst maybe
So there's
generations and
sort of two,
classes?
yeah, it's there's sort of two-part answer to it. I'm going to ask the first part of that first, and then I think re-ask that last bit of the question to me, because I think about talking about it. So the first thing is, I think we need to understand, in the US, like the UK and most of Europe, is that millennials came of age and entered the workplace at a time when essentially wages flatlined, and asset prices and price of education and prices of a price of healthcare and childcare rose considerably, particularly housing. I mean, housing is the big issue for millennials and now Gen Z, but particularly housing, but also the other big ticket items in life. They became increasingly expensive just at the time as wages flatlined. Now, wages have gone up since COVID considerably, particularly in the US, but they haven't kept pace with housing, right? And certainly education. And what happened was, what became expensive, our parents, if they could, and that's some, not all, stepped in to fill
The gap.
the gap, right?
Yeah.
So that's where you've got the rise of the bank of mum and dad, particularly post 2008, right? There's always been inheritance. There's always been parental help. There's nothing new about that. But what did certainly happen and has happened for millennials is, and now Gen Z, is that the bank of mum and dad became this really important safety net and springboard into adulthood. And partly also, we were doing things later than our parents. We were having children later. We were getting, married later if we could, or cohabitating later. We were finishing our education later. We were, being financially independent of our parents much later. And in many respects, I think it's a weird combination of, it's given us more freedom, but it's all, and more choices, particularly women, but it's also given us greater dependency on our parents. And the bank of mum and dad has bankrolled not just childhood, but what I call kidulthood. Those years between 18 to 35, basically. And I wrote the book. Because I wanted to understand why me getting a PhD at a university and taking the education track right through to academia didn't serve me as well, or wasn't as sufficient as in carving out opportunity in my life, as having parents that could actually help me, fund me, support me, and catapult me into adulthood when I decided to do all the responsible things in life. So actually, it's an autobiography, the book, because it's about me going, hang on a minute, my generation were told, get to university, it's a meritocracy. That pathway into professional, stable, middle class, financially secure life is that way. Education, education, education. And actually what happened was the complete opposite, which was who your parents were and how much they could help you was increasingly the pathway to opportunity. So that's the kind of story, is that certain things became expensive post 2008 and mum and dad stepped in. Now, certain things became cheap, right? Eating out, right? We know all those coffees and avocado on toast. That's why we can't afford houses. No, actually, food and eating out used to be really expensive, became increasingly cheap. Travel, the democratization of travel.
Sure.
And obviously technology as well, the universalism of the smartphone, and what that gave us was access to the world's marketplace and the world's information. And so it's not just a story of this generation is screwed. I think it's more that there's a very particular economic story. Now, it's a slightly different one for Gen Z, but the key thing is that point at which wages weren't buying us what they bought our parents. And so we have an economy now where you're more likely to get on the housing ladder by being loyal to your parents than being loyal to your boss. And, a bonus from work isn't as useful, or isn't as likely to lead to a house purchase or paying off your student debt than a bonus from mum and dad. This is where, and I think is at the root of the slight disillusionment with work has come from. It's not from COVID. It's from the fact that economics of wages have fundamentally changed.
I'm going to have to ask you a philosophical question here. So a large cohort is getting access to the bank of mom and dad. That has obviously made their life easier to live. And we've talked about the big ticket items. We've talked about housing. We've talked about education, to some degree, healthcare here in the States.
Yeah.
But there are also there's just the small ticket items too, like staying on the family's mobile plan, or,
Yes.
having your groceries paid
Netflix.
for, or your credit card, or your
Holidays.
Netflix. Exactly. So
Yeah.
I think when people hear the bank of mom and dad, they hear these big ticket items. The reality is it's all items. It's all discretionary
It's
income.
so interesting. They did a fantastic consumer survey in Canada about 10 years ago. So it's 10 years ago, where they asked what age do you think you should be sort of funding or economically supporting your kids? At what age? What's the cutoff point where you really think they should be independent of you? 30. 30
Wow.
was the average age. Now that's and actually there's some mirroring data in the US and the UK on that front. Is that it's this, I think, this weird point at which families were getting smaller. Increasingly, both parents were working. There was a culture of parental surveillance, a culture of parental investment, and combined with sort of a debilitating economics of early adulthood has meant that the bank of mum and dad, you're right, isn't just about house prices and deposits. It's also about childcare and childcare support. It's all about, multi-generational holidays. I mean, look at White Lotus. It's all about a multi-generational holiday this latest season. It's not just about the big ticket items in life, and it's not just about economics. We're living in an era now where, whether you're talking about the Kardashians or the Knowles or the Beckhams, we live in an era of dynasties. It's multi-generational sort of families as brands, and a sense of succession. One of the reasons why I think that was such a successful show is, yes, we want to kind of sort of insight into the super rich, but I think it's also because it was about the sort of tensions within a multi-generational setup and a blended family that we all actually can relate to.
Right.
More than we like to think.
So the philosophical question is this. So you've got parents helping their kids out. Do you think that took pressure off the adult children to then pressure their employers for higher salaries? So we got caught in this loop of salaries remaining depressed in part because of the bank of mom and dad?
I would say that the economics of wage suppression are a bit more complicated than not enough people asking for higher wages. Quantitative easing and the whole economics that sort of came to fruition after 2008 meant that assets rose and wages stalled. But I think that the fallout has been that we are more likely now to really depend on our parents than invest in a particular company for that. And again, it's like, some but not all. We can't overgeneralize here. It's important to recognize that there are true meritocratic success stories, and I highlight them in the book. And there are true examples where education has just released someone into a path of opportunity they wouldn't have had without it. I think, generally speaking, in the US, there is still a real aspiration to create generational wealth, a real confidence when you, in the US, talk about, I want to build generational wealth as a point of pride. By the way, you would never say that in the UK because it's a point of shame. And I think sort of like, just no one would say it. They just would be totally sort of shamed into sort of silence if they were ever to articulate that. So I think, and it's part of that American dream. But to go back to your original question about why do we need to talk about it, the book is called Meritocracy. It's time to talk about the bank of mum and dad. It's time to talk about the bank of mum and dad with our parents, right? Because they're not getting any younger. And unless we plan for inheritance, conflict ensues. Conflict is inevitable. Conflict between siblings, conflict, and will disputes, all of these things become incredibly complicated if you don't talk about them. So we need to talk about the bank of mum and dad with our parents. We also need to talk about the bank of mum and dad with our peers, because I think there is almost a kind of, and social media for sort of gives fuel to this sense of the haves and the have-nots without actually understanding the sort of economic story behind the haves and the have-nots, because there's a perception that, if you work really hard, you can get all these lovely things and demonstrate them on social media. The truth is that lovely kitchen, was bought by your parents, or worse, by your in-laws. So I think like the sort of, you need to be talking and being open about this within your friendship groups, because it needs to be out in the open, the extent to which there is this dependency culture on mum and dad. And the third thing is we need to be talking about it within society and frankly at a government level, because we cannot have a situation, I think it's really unhealthy and demotivating to have a situation where inheritance matters so much. We need to make it matter less. I'm not saying that people shouldn't be able to pass on their wealth. I'm a beneficiary of parental wealth. How would I argue otherwise? But I think we need to make it matter less and make opportunity far more open than it currently is today. Because if anything, it's narrowing rather than widening.
Right. So I want to pivot just briefly to talk about family creation. And I'm wondering if you have some insights on how this dependence or lack of dependence on parental wealth is affecting decisions around marriage, children, and kind of home life more broadly.
The economic conditions to have children, or even have a second child or a third child or a fourth child, are at the center of millennials' minds and Gen Z minds. And I think the fundamental reason there is not because of the rise of the bank of mom and dad, but because of the changing economic and career status of women. And the global fertility rate has halved, and that's largely not entirely down to women becoming better educated. It's fundamentally become about women's place in society. And we're not just talking about their desire to procreate and their desire to stay at home or be carers for children. It's also about being carers for the elderly, and I think that sort of caring role, that predominantly feminine caring role in society, has not really been addressed in an era where women now outstrip and outperform boys and men at college, and increasingly at work in their 20s. So we haven't yet come up with a solution for that dilemma. So I think that's hugely front and center. The cost of having a child now is a really interesting question, because frankly, women have had a lot more babies in much tougher economic conditions, right? So this is, yes, we can talk about the cost of childcare. Yes, we can talk about, the infrastructure that's there or not there for women that want to work and have children. But, the birth rate in the Scandinavian countries, where they have amazing sort of state infrastructure for women that have kids and company policies for women that want to return to work, are no greater than in the US.
Yeah,
so
they're
I
actually
think
lower.
Yeah, exactly. That kind of overemphasis, I think we tend to have when talking about sort of birth rates around, well, if only we had better childcare infrastructure, or if only we had better, maternity services and protections and stuff. I think that's true. I do think, that is an important conversation to have, but it's not the only conversation to have. I think the role of mum and dad is quite interesting. Now, I'll give you an example of someone I interviewed in the book. She's in her 40s. She actually didn't have children. She never wanted children. She was a product of divorce. She was 42. Her name was Lucy. She lived in Scotland. And she had been with her partner since her mid-20s. And they'd been together. They had, shared a life together. They were very happy. She was very in love. But she was like, I do not want to co-join my finances with my partner. Mm-hmm. And it's partly because I've seen what happens when, as I saw with my mother, when partners split up, the disadvantage that my mother was in financially when they went through that divorce, I'll never forget, and I will never be in that position. And so she actually had her own property. She had her own bank account. She was entirely financially independent of her partner. And she had a shared bank account with her mother, because they were managing a property, but not with her partner. Now, in that tale of Lucy, 42 from Scotland, is a really interesting broader trend, which is we talk about the economic rise and independence of women, and that's been the great success story of the last 30 years, combined with their rise in the workplace. But for millennial women, it's also come with an increasingly dependent relationship on their parents and a less dependent relationship on their partner, a particularly male partner, right? So, and that's across the board, both middle class and working class.
Codependent or
families.
dependent? Codependent or dependent?
So less dependent on their partner, more dependent on their parents.
So dependent on parents, not codependent with their parents.
The important thing here is, though, is that depending on the financial situation of the parents, they could be significantly wealthier than the daughter and their partner, or they could be, just a bit wealthier, or can help out with childcare, or could allow them to live with them while they save for a deposit, or whatever it is. What's very clear now is as baby boomers get older, if we've had for 20 years the bank of mum and dad supporting the children, at some point in every family, and it happened within my own, the natural care reversal process where you then have to parent your parents and support your parents, maybe not in terms of money, but certainly in terms of time and potentially on-site care, is what's beginning to happen. So the great wealth transfer, we talk about the money trickling down. Well, at some point, that money may have to trickle back up again or be translated into time. So we've noticed that, obviously millennial women have had babies later, they've had fewer children, they're having them closer together, right? So looking after children has become, for boomers, for Xers and now millennials and now Gen Z, actually a much shorter period of our lives in terms of that preschool, that intense period of preschool children that need to look after them and be on site and look after those children. Where the bigger care obligation is, and you're already seeing this with Gen Xers in particular, and increasingly now millennials, is looking after our parents. And that affects and impacts child-free women as much as women, obviously, with children. And I say women because still, women predominantly do most of the elder care, not just in respect to their own parents, but also in terms of their in-laws as well. So not just in terms of their own parents, but in terms of their in-laws, caring for their in-laws as well. And that's the conversation that we don't have enough when we're talking about all this cash trickling down.
Right.
Is that actually either the cash has got to go back up to help outsource some care and bring in some sort of structure and support and paid service to help with the elderly in society, or the care has to be done not just by the daughters but by the sons as well, because if mum and dad helped buy the house and paid your college tuition and supported you up until the age of 30 with Netflix subscriptions and mobile phone subscriptions and God knows what else, you have a sense of obligation. But you know what? People have obligation obviously anyway too. And in many senses, what we're talking about here is a sort of a time when the market has become more dysfunctional and the state, certainly isn't there to provide that care. The family has become more important, and the family has become, in a sense, more Asian in that sort of, in China or India, that multi-generational sense of obligation, 3 generations, sometimes 4 generations, not just that kind of 2-generation family, is the natural sort of not just living state, but also obviously care. And so I think there's if we were to look at this sort of money trickling down, we have to also look at the broader context in which this story is unfolding.
Eliza, we're coming near the end of our time now, and I'm wondering if you might be able to offer the folks that are tuning in today that might be on the receiving end of this great wealth transfer or the bank of mom and dad 3 pointers on how to manage this period of their life, since it's novel for many people.
I think the most important thing is to start the conversation with your parents, and about not just about money and wills and all of that kind of stuff, but about values around money and expectations around care and expectations around where they live, and have a really honest conversation that quite often I see not many families are actually doing. And that can be really difficult if you feel economically infantilized by your parents, because even initiating that conversation might not get you anywhere. But I would urge all families to start having that conversation, and then think in terms of your own sort of legacy and your own building of wealth, and potentially what that means for you and maybe your children. Thinking about, how you want to help your children, and what I don't see the intergenerational wealth going anywhere. I don't see the cost of housing, education, healthcare going anywhere. So, what kinds of conversations do we need to be having, amongst ourselves, with our partners, potentially even with our children, about, how do we want to fund their early adulthood? And what do we expect, maybe not in return, but for that deal to look like? And what sacrifices or not are you prepared to get that sort of sorted? And then the third thing is really, I would involve professional services in all of these.
Right.
Because these
Call
are
a
not
lawyer.
easy. Well, therapist, maybe. And
No.
I would say that often getting help to navigate these financial, but frankly, it's emotional and relational, complex issues here. And so whether we're talking about a lawyer, whether we're talking about a financial advisor, whether we're talking about, a care specialist, or whether, whatever it is, having that external voice, that sage, that wisdom, that neutral voice can be incredibly useful in facilitating these really difficult conversations. And, as someone that has experienced it, I definitely couldn't have a conversation with my close relatives about this issue. We had to resort to an external expert and an advisor who really helped navigate us through this. And they had to show great empathy. They had to show, obviously, super knowledge, but they had to be a great teacher in helping us navigate what is an incredibly complex landscape full of emotion, family history, and different values around money. And don't expect you and your family to all agree on something that is incredibly complex.
Eliza, amazing insights and advice. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
As Dr. Eliza Filby has told us, the Bank of Mom and Dad and the great wealth transfer are becoming so much more normalized around the world. And this is creating real winners and losers and making it harder for people without that great wealth transfer at hand to reach their full potential. I encourage you to reach out to Eliza Filby on LinkedIn. Of course, check out her website and definitely read her book. I've left a link to all of those in the show notes. Again, I'm Bradley Sherman, and this is Population Next. If you want to dive deeper in today's episode or learn more about how these demographic changes are reshaping the world, and yes, indeed, your finances, please reach out at LinkedIn or, of course, visit us at populationnext.com.